right, well, I think we should get started. I have a feeling we'll have other people join us as we begin. But thank you, everyone, for finding time for this event today. For those of you that I don't already know, I'm Debbie Schildkraut. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department, and we thought it would be valuable to have an event that was not in the immediate wake of the election, but a little bit afterwards, where we had a little bit more distance from Election Day to digest and think about what to expect. Normally, when we do this kind of event, it's really with an eye towards what to expect in the upcoming president's next term. But we knew when we scheduled this that there was a possibility we wouldn't either know who the next president is yet, or that we may have a sense of who it would be, but that if it wasn't Trump, that he wouldn't have conceded. So that introduces new questions about what to expect, not just about what may happen in the next administration, but what may happen in the next couple of weeks and months. So we've put together an excellent panel today. Before we begin, I just want to thank all of our panelists and all of our departmental and program co-sponsors. In addition to political science, our co-sponsors today are Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, the International Relations Program, the Department of Psychology, and the Department of Sociology. And I'd also like to thank the political science staff for helping us organize this event and, importantly, to publicize the event. So I've asked our panelists today to offer no more than 5 minutes of introductory remarks on how our current moment relates to their area of expertise, and to share their thoughts on where they think things are headed in that area. We have a lot of panelists, but we should have a lot of time for question and answer after that. We'll be using the chat function for questioning, and in my role as moderator, I'll field the questions, but you don't have to wait till the end of the prepared remarks to post your questions. Anytime a question comes to you, just put it in the chat and we'll try to get to it when we can. And I also may use my privilege as moderator throughout the event to ask questions as we go along. We are using the meeting functionality of Zoom and not the webinar functionality, so it's nice that we can see all of you for those of you who want to have your cameras on, but please do keep your mute on unless you're one of the presenters speaking or unless you're asking a question. I also recognize that there are many important issue areas that confront our nation and the incoming administration that we don't have time to address today, or that are not part of the formal remarks for our panelists. We have an embarrassment of riches in terms of experts that could be on this panel, and certainly no shortage of important challenges facing the country. So we did have to make some tough choices about what to include, but I do recognize that are some things that you may be very interested in that aren't getting headlined today. So I'll give a brief introduction to our panelists, and they'll be offering their 5-minute introductory remarks in this order. So first, we're joined with Professor Jeff Berry, who's the John Richard Skuse Class of 1941 Professor of Political Science, and his area of expertise is American politics on Congress, bureaucracy, interest groups, and the media. Then we will hear from Professor Jeff Taliaferro, Professor of Political Science, with a focus on international relations. We will hear from Professor Sarah Fong, Assistant Professor of the Study of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora, who focuses on histories of racialization and of colonialization in the United States. Then we'll hear from Professor Keith Maddox, Associate Professor of Psychology, who focuses on social psychology, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Next will be Professor Oxana Shevel, Associate Professor of Political Science, with a focus on post-Soviet politics. Then Professor Gilbert Metcalf, the John DiBiagio Professor of Citizenship and Public Service and Professor of Economics, who focuses on environmental economics. Then Professor Natasha Warikoo, Professor of Sociology, whose work focuses on racial and ethnic inequality in education. And then Professor Michael Beckley, Associate Professor of Political Science, whose research focuses on international relations and Chinese politics. So with that, I conclude my introductory remarks and I yield the floor to Professor Berry.
Thank you, and it's great to see my colleagues inside and outside of the department. I'm going to use my 5 minutes to talk about the congressional election. There's already been a lot of really good analysis of the presidential election, but I think there's some important things that went on with the congressional vote that we have to think about in terms of understanding the American voter and how things go forward. The congressional election, unlike the presidential election, was very much a surprise. We expected Biden to win, although he won by a narrower margin, but there was every expectation that the Democrats would actually increase their majority in the House and probably take over the Senate, and Senate's still outstanding, but they barely held on to the House of Representatives. And it wasn't a polling error. There's a beyond polling. House elections are predicted by nerdy people that talk to people on the ground in all 435 districts, and they're usually pretty good, like the Cook Report and Inside Elections, and they were way off. And so there's something going on there about the American voter that we did not understand. It doesn't have to do with the uniqueness of Donald Trump, who's maybe a one-off. So let me use the remainder of my 5 minutes to make 3 points. First is that the election was a terrible blow to the Democrats and to Biden's hopes for his ambitious agenda. And it gets worse to the Democrats because in 2022, they're likely to lose seats in the House and therefore lose the majority. I say that because there's a strong pattern of party out of power in the White House, that is in this case the Republicans, gaining seats in the next election as voters become dissatisfied with the party in power. Also, Democrats aren't as faithful voters as Republicans, so that there may be a turnout differential in 2022 that favors Republicans. Also, we have reapportionment coming, and that hits the Democrats in 2 ways. There are seats from northern states that are going to go to Republican states. Texas is picking up 3 seats, and as well as a chance for states that do allocate their seats or apportion their seats by political process rather than by independent commission. The Democrats are going to get beat there too in states like Texas and Florida. Secondly, there's little chance that there's going to be much of any bipartisanship in this administration, even though Joe Biden is a much more reasonable person than Donald Trump, and he's happy to deal and take half a loaf rather than full loaf. It's not an ideologue. The Republican incentive is to be uncooperative. The Republican Party can't wait for the next election because they're going to ascribe the loss of the presidency simply to Trump, and they believe on the basis of the congressional elections that they are the majority party in this country, and they will not do anything to help Biden unless it helps them and their cause. So there'll be a few things that are passed that are necessary to pass, but by and large, you're going to see pretty much what you've been seeing in recent decades, which is just very high degrees of party line voting and lack of cooperation. Finally, getting back to the third point, getting back to the election, what happened? I've been trying to understand that, and here's a few thoughts. First is on the wake of the blue wave in 2018 election, the 2019-2020 Congress, the Democrats, didn't generate a really strong record. The most distinctive thing about the Congress was the impeachment, which the Democrats, a lot of Democrats didn't want to get involved in, but they were dragged into it by the progressives in the party. Pelosi had to be dragged kicking and screaming on it. And the rest of the session of Congress was really unmemorable. Along those same lines, the congressional campaign by the Democrats didn't have a compelling message. What they said, basically, they're relying on 2 things. One is, we're not Donald Trump, we're the opposition. And that wasn't a sufficient message. It maybe helped Biden, but it didn't seem to help Democrats down the ticket. The second thing is, I believe they expected that COVID would be have more of an impact on the electorate. And my guess is that voters didn't hold congressional Republicans responsible for the terrible record that this administration has on COVID. Instead, saw them as individuals and took back some of the seats that the Democrats won in swing districts. And I think we need to go further and try to understand this better if we are going to have a clear idea of where American politics is headed. And I will stop there, and hopefully I made it within 5 minutes, Debbie.
That was perfect. Thank you. And thanks for drawing our attention to reapportionment. I always tell my students that election years that end in a 2 are always really kooky. And we have one coming up, and we usually see more retirements, more incumbents getting defeated in primaries, and they're always a little unsettled because they're the first election after the redistricting that always throws a wrench into what normally happens. So yeah, thinking ahead about what lies ahead for Congress doesn't suggest smooth sailing for a Biden administration. Okay, so next up we have Professor Jeff Taliaferro.
Okay, Thank you so much, Debbie, and thanks for all of you for joining me this afternoon, or joining us this afternoon. I'm going to shift gears and talk a bit about the foreign policy challenges, the national security challenges that the Biden administration is going to face. Joe Biden campaigned as a multilateralist, as somebody who believed that the United States has an active role to play in promoting international peace and stability, and that the Trump administration abdicated the United States leadership responsibility in a whole host of reasons, whole host of issues, from strategic arms control with Russia to trade disputes with China, abandoned the NATO allies, and sided with authoritarian regimes. And he has promised to reverse that. The dilemmas that Biden is going to face, however, are considerable. And I'm going to begin with the domestic constraints and follow up on some of the points that Professor Berry made just a moment ago. Not only is Biden coming into office with a very contentious, very divided Congress, in which the Republicans have absolutely no incentive to work with him, he's inheriting a national security bureaucracy which has been hobbled by the Trump administration over the past 4 years. Yes, the Biden transition team will bring back, will appoint a number of very high profile, very seasoned, experienced people to senior level positions. But over the past 4 years, the State Department has been politicized, and the number of career Foreign Service officers who have retired or who have been forced out has increased. The diversity of the Foreign Service Officer Corps has dramatically decreased under this administration. The intelligence community has been actively vilified by Donald Trump, who derided them as the deep state. And any officials in the intelligence community who did their job in a nonpartisan manner ran afoul of the president, beginning with Trump's own director of national intelligence, former Republican senator from Indiana, Dan Coats. The Defense Department, in particular the Office of Secretary of Defense, has been decapitated with the firing of Secretary of Defense Mark Eggers. The number of vacant positions, 3 years, 4 years into the Trump administration is just astounding. So Biden is going to come in with a national security apparatus, and those were just the executive departments. I didn't even talk about the NSC staff, but he's going to be coming into power with a national security apparatus, national security bureaucracy that really needs to be rebuilt. The second constraint that Biden is going to face, and it's a big one, is that the world has changed since 2016. China has increased its power and influence, in part because the United States has been so internally divided, and the Trump administration's East Asia policies have been so erratic. Russia is in a much stronger strategic position than it was 4 years ago, in part because its campaign of hybrid interference and disinformation was wildly successful in 2016 and continues to this present day. And finally, Biden is going to face a very difficult task in convincing US allies in the Pacific and especially in Western Europe that not only is the United States back, but the United States involvement is going to be sustainable, particularly when the new president has such a weak domestic base at home. So I'm going to stop it there and finish just actually 20 seconds early. So thank you.
Excellent. Let me ask you a quick follow-up. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about Biden's ability to meet these challenges that you laid out?
Debbie, no one has ever used the word optimistic in reference to me, ever. I'm not. I am not. I mean, I wish President-elect Biden and his administration well. I know, or at least professionally know, several people who are under consideration for senior level positions in the new administration. And they are competent people, but I think the magnitude of the challenges that they're going to face both domestically and internationally just ought not to be underestimated. And all of this, of course, is taking place in the context of a global pandemic.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Next, we turn it to Professor Fong.
Hi, thank you so much, Debbie, and thank you to everyone for being here today. I am going to take a step back from the immediate moment that we're in and try to give a little bit of historical context to what we are seeing today. And I think this is important because there seems to be a widespread feeling that we are in an unprecedented moment. And certainly we are in a very strange moment, but American history tells us that we have actually been here before, in the sense of being in a moment of intense reckoning around the racial identity of the nation, coupled with profound electoral uncertainty. So I want to take us back to the Civil War era for a moment. As many of you likely know, if you are a student of American history, after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, the United States entered into the Reconstruction era. In this period, the federal government intervened in the governance of Southern states and enforced or tried to protect the expansion of rights to Black citizens. So in this period, formerly enslaved people and free Black people were extended the right to vote, were elected into public office, gained new access to educational institutions, were able to buy property. These were all really significant gains for the question of Black freedom and citizenship. At the same time, these were highly contested. So throughout the Reconstruction era, there were campaigns of widespread racial violence throughout the South and in some areas of the North, as well as people who were committed to a vision of the United States as a white nation contested the gains of Black citizenship. This happens over a course of about 10 years, from 1865 to 1876. And in 1876, the presidential election was contested. So again, the Republican Party candidate and the Democratic Party candidate claimed to have won the election. In this moment, the nation is in a deep economic depression. Southern states are growing increasingly resentful with federal intervention into state governance. And Northern communities are growing weary and tired of having to fight for and support the rights of Black people. So you have this sort of perfect storm of an opportunity to walk away from the commitment to defend the freedom and citizenship of Black people. So Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate, is awarded the presidency. And it's important to remember that in this period, the Republican Party was the party of the Union, the party that hesitatingly fought for abolition, and the Democrats were the party of the white supremacist Confederacy. In a series of negotiations, some secret, some public, the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, was awarded the White House in exchange for agreeing to end federal intervention into the South. So what happens with the Compromise of 1877 is an opportunity for Southern states to roll back all of the gains and rights that had been extended to African descended people. So Black citizens are disenfranchised, they are removed from public office, they are increasingly subjected to legal segregation, and shortly thereafter, the nation is plunged into 80 years of Jim Crow segregation. So I think what I want us to think about in this moment is the possibility that winning the presidency may be insufficient. Today, the Democrats may come to occupy the White House and still lose the cultural or political battle with the forces of white supremacy. Continued and widespread support for the Trump presidency and the kinds of policies that it stands in for suggests that the problems we are facing extend well beyond the sphere of electoral politics. Then, as now, the nation was faced by violent conflict over the racial identity of the nation and a crisis of political power. In 1876, the party that represented Black citizens abandoned them in order to win the presidency. So the questions that I want us to sit with today and in the coming weeks is what happens this time if we allow ourselves to be content with simply winning the presidency? And I know it is not simple to have won the presidency, but my point is that the problems we are facing are beyond the sphere of electoral politics. What happens if we limit the scope of our struggles to electoral office? And what happens if we do not maintain a clear-eyed vision of and commitment to undoing white supremacy in all of its forms? So that's, I think this historical moment offers some important lessons and pitfalls for focusing narrowly on electoral politics. And I won't talk about it now because I want to be respectful of the time, but I can talk about it more in the Q&A, as I think that this speaks to the questions around the Trump administration's moves to bar the study of race in universities. I think that what we are seeing is that there is a much wider, broader cultural push against recognition of racial inequality and those historical struggles. And so I think that one of the fronts that we need to be engaging on outside of electoral politics is really studying the history of our nation truthfully, understanding the contradictions of being an American citizen, and really centering our understanding of race and colonization as central elements of US history and contemporary life.
Thank you so much for that. I often find it oddly simultaneously comforting and profoundly depressing to think about how we've been here before. Comforting in the sense of the nation survives, and over the grand course of history, some forms of progress get made, but to feel like you're reliving something that you thought was past but clearly isn't is hard to accept also. And I definitely look forward to discussing more Trump's stance, particularly his executive order and what it might mean for, how we even have events like this, and talk about the issues that we're confronted with and how we address them. So thank you so much for that. And now we turn to Professor Maddox.
Thank you. So I wanted to, I think, actually follow up a little bit with or complement what Sarah was saying, or Dr. Fong was saying. With respect to thinking about the current moment, the focus on anti-racism efforts and how we've sort of seen those develop, and in part how they were augmented by the COVID-19 crisis. So as I'm a social psychologist, and so I'm really interested in studying sort of thoughts, feelings, and actions when we're thinking about or in the presence of other people. And so the nature of sort of how social influence takes place, how we look to others in order to determine our own actions, feelings, things like that, is sort of in my bailiwick. But the comments today are sort of thinking about the extent to which the COVID-19 crisis, and I don't think this is necessarily debatable, but COVID-19 was a response that really created a heightened sensitivity for some of the issues having to do with race and racial inequality in our society, in part because it helped to provide a sense of empathy for individuals in a couple of different ways. So one, we started to hear a little bit more about the ways in which the crisis was affecting people disparately based on their race and ethnicity, the extent to which COVID was affecting communities of color more rampantly than it was affecting majority communities. We also had a context to sort of understand that, in the sense that, trying to understand the ways in which disparate opportunities, access to health and healthcare were the kinds of factors. These weren't factors that had to do with individuals and their nature. Their factors had to do with sort of systems and structure, in the sense that COVID also required us to have a response that required all of us to start to think a little bit about how the infrastructure of our healthcare system wasn't going to be able to sustain the impact of this virus. So it got people thinking about really broad systemic kinds of changes and factors having to do with systems and infrastructure that could potentially have implications for the outcomes of different groups of people. And traditionally, what I think we do is we often think about the outcomes of others, whether they're disparate or not, and we're more likely to think about those as being something about them, about their characteristics and qualities. Sometimes we use racial, ethnic, other types of stereotypes that provide us with sort of built-in trait-based explanations for the outcomes and behaviors of other people. But COVID really helped to raise the sensitivity about how systems, how context can play a huge role in terms of determining people's outcomes that's independent of their actual individual actions. And those two things are not sort of, they're ends of a continuum, but obviously there are often situational and dispositional factors that can contribute to people's behavior and outcomes, but we tend to ignore the situation. And this attention to sort of the structural characteristics and qualities that could lead to disparate outcomes, the fact that we're all affected in a lot of ways. I mean, obviously there's disparate outcome, but creating a level of empathy amongst individuals who normally don't have to think about these kinds of issues. Now, something about the system, something about the structure is affecting their outcomes, and they recognize that. And that creates a sort of a heightened sense of, potential empathy to be able to identify and see some of the issues and problems that other communities are facing. And while I mentioned the effect of COVID on the communities of color, there's also obviously the George Floyd incident that seemed to be sort of a moment that led to a greater sort of recognition and awareness of the nature of racial discrimination and the need for systemic change. But I think the reason that that conversation is a little different this time and why it's taking hold is because of the increased empathy that people had in the context of COVID-19. So I think what I wanted to focus on is really just the extent to which that's going to continue, whether or not we have the will to continue our anti-racism efforts. And I think I'm, to borrow Jeff's outlook, pessimistic, in part because of the correlation that people have between COVID, racism, and Donald Trump. The idea is that I think that a lot of the kinds of attitudes that might have led to endorsement in COVID might have led to endorsement of anti-racism became politicized because of Donald Trump, his rhetoric and his policies. And that kind of opposition that was fueling a lot of work and effort will be gone if Donald Trump is gone. To some extent, it's going to dissipate. And we're already seeing a little bit of evidence of that, in that the politicization has led to sort of increases with respect to people's endorsement of COVID or anti-COVID kinds of measures, endorsement of anti-racism measures, and the kinds of indices for support of those things tends to be dropping off. And without somebody who's essentially sort of a target for those things, the extent to which they're associated with Trump and not associated with, let's say, the Republican Party, maybe takes away some of people's sort of motivation incentive to start to continue to engage in those kinds of efforts. I think the other thing is that as we do hopefully move to some sense of normalcy over time, that the extent to which people start to be able to get back to their normal activities and the distractions that may be inherent in those normal activities is also going to take away a lot of motivation in terms of individuals' motivation to engage in anti-racism efforts. So I think that's the kind of the perspective that I wanted to bring in, is to start to talk a little bit about whether or not we're going to be able to maintain the energy that we seem to have around anti-racism efforts in order to actually lead to real systemic change and not just talk like we've had in the past.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. One thing I tell my students a lot is that, political scientists have a lot of explaining to do in the coming years. And one of the things that I think we still don't really understand is just why Donald Trump's approval ratings were so stable. And the types of things we normally expect would move a president's approval rating just didn't seem to move him at all. If you compare his approval rating over time compared to past presidents, it really stands out as completely different. And whether that's something that now characterizes presidential politics or whether this is something unique to Trump is something we still don't really know. And your comments make me think about that more broadly in how much of partisan politics we see today will revert back to more of what we saw in a pre-Trump era versus this is just what it is now, regardless of whether Trump's in office or not, is a really important thing that we're going to need to be tracking. So thank you so much. Okay, next up we have Professor Shevel.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Debbie, and all the panelists. I have 5 minutes, as all of us, and I just want to touch upon two implications of the current moment for the region that I work on, which is the post-Soviet region, Russia specifically, but also countries in that neighborhood. And the two things I want to comment on is first, I think we need to be aware of a really long-term damage that I think was done for some of the key long-term objectives of the US foreign policy that were caused both by the current Trump campaign to undermine the election results, but arguably by the legacy of Trump presidency more generally. So I'm going to say a few words about that. And then I also want to say a few words about kind of looking forward in the near term, because we are bad at predicting near term, let alone the long term. But I think there are a few things that we can sort of reasonably expect the future of US-Russian relations to be and US policy towards Russia to be. And I think what I'm going to say is going to dialogue in some ways with what Professor Taliaferro was saying earlier. So let me start with the damage. On the one hand, I think the fact that if actually Joe Biden is installed as president and Trump's attempt to question the electoral outcome is defeated, which looks likely, right? We can say that this is perhaps a good thing for democracy globally, because strong men in the post-communist region, such as Russian President Putin or Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, in a way are sort of learning that have an affirmation that democracy can withstand the strong men, that the facts do count, that democratic institutions such as courts and so forth can withstand autocratic leaders. But here I think kind of the positive spin ends, because I think on the other hand, the damage that is done by both the current debacle that Trump created, questioning the validity of election results, and arguably kind of the longer term disregard for democratic values that we've seen from this presidency, I think really is going to undermine the credibility of US democracy promotion efforts, as well as its anti-corruption efforts around the world, and especially not exclusively, but especially in the post-Soviet region. So the shadow that is cast, I think, is going to be problematic. What credibility will US have when criticizing autocrats, post-communist autocrats who are attempting to steal elections? I would say, I think there's going to be less credibility, or at least there is going to be a narrative now that US has less credibility in this regard. I think that the US in the past was able to speak from the position of authority and experience when criticizing electoral abuses everywhere. Now I think that is going to be severely weakened. In what ways, I don't think we quite yet know. So this is something kind of thinking about the implications for the study of the region. I think this would be one of the things that scholars of post-communist politics are going to be looking to studying in the upcoming years and potentially even further. And I think also the anti-corruption efforts that, again, Biden specifically signaled as going to be one of the priorities of his administration, including together with democracy promotion and human rights protection and promotion, I think would also potentially be weakened or at least severely complicated. So that's kind of one point that I want to make. Now, on the second issue that I wanted to also address briefly on the likely near-term future on the relations with Russia specifically and implications for post-Soviet region more generally, I think here we are looking kind of interestingly at a sort of paradox, right? On the one hand, and here I'm going to echo some of the things Professor Taliaferro already said, I think foreign policy priorities and values of the new administration under President Biden are going to be significantly different from what we had seen with the Trump presidency. On the other hand, I think we should not really expect major changes in US policy towards Russia or US-Russian relations more generally, and let me kind of briefly elaborate on this. So on the different priorities, I think what we would see from the Biden administration is more values-based foreign policy as opposed to kind of deal-making approach to foreign policy. Biden clearly holds importance of values such as alliances with Western democracies, with NATO specifically. He talked in his foreign affairs article from April of this year, promising to, quote, renew our core values, to take, quote unquote, immediate steps to renew US alliances, fight corruption, defend authoritarianism, promote human rights, right? None of the things that Trump administration placed high priorities on, right? And I think we can also expect the rhetoric emanating from the White House to be both kind of more moderate and more really reflective of what US policy is. Now, so given that, like, why then we shouldn't expect the substance really of US policy towards Russia or US-Russian relations to change that dramatically? I think the short answer to this is that the adversarial relations that exist between US and Russia, which one could say at all times low since the end of the Cold War and arguably further deteriorated since Biden was last in office as a vice president in the Obama administration, there are objective reasons for this deterioration, and these reasons are likely to remain in the near future. There is essentially broad bipartisan consensus among US policymakers that Russia is a revisionist power with autocratic leadership that tried to meddle in US elections in 2016, that invaded and annexed territory of a neighboring state, Crimea and Ukraine, that poisoning its opponents, including in Western countries, with highly dangerous radioactive and chemical agents, that commits human rights abuses in Syria, and the list goes on, right? So Russia, of course, denies all these charges, and this is exactly why I think it will be hard to have some sort of major change in the relations, because there isn't really no expectation I don't think, at least, that we would see any change coming from Russia as far as either admitting that it has done these things or doing things differently. In fact, Putin's framing of Russian policy in terms of conflict with the West is an important part of his kind of legitimization narrative. So in a peculiar way, Trump's kind of America First foreign policy kind of dovetailed on Kremlin's desire to weaken Western alliances and expand Russian influence around the world. So again, kind of, I think it's an interesting paradox. So we can expect to see quite a lot of change as far as sort of values and rhetoric coming from the Biden White House, but not really expect much change in relations as a result. But to try to end on a more optimistic note, maybe I'm actually not even sure if I agree with this, but potentially there might be some smaller changes in US-Russian relations because of this kind of greater rationality, predictability, lack of crazy rhetoric. We may see some cooperation on more limited set of issues that are clearly of mutual importance and mutual significance, mutual interest for US and Russia, such as nuclear non-proliferation, maybe cybersecurity, terrorism, and things like this. So Biden already signaled interest in extension of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So again, kind of we can see some cooperation, but not, I don't think, any dramatic changes. So I'll end there. I hope I'm not too much over time.
Oh, that was perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Shevel. And now we turn to Professor Metcalf.
Great. Thank you, Debbie. And it's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm really enjoying these conversations. So as an economist, I'm obligated by my union card to show you some graphs. So let me do that. Hopefully you can see my screen. And let me, my remit is to talk a little bit about the economy. And the big issues, there are three. Obviously, the first big issue is the pandemic. We lead the world in the deaths per million people. And if you look at the United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, you'll see that these are countries that are actually beginning to turn down a little bit, whether this is a permanent or a temporary a peak. We are not doing that. Second point about the pandemic is that it has led to the most severe recession in the United States since the Great Depression. We are down significantly from the peak and much worse than in the 2007, 2009 recession. So there's been enormous damage done by the pandemic to our economy and to households. And there's a very unequal impact of this recession. You'll see that leisure and hospitality, temporary workers have seen huge drops in payroll versus the finance sector, retail. These are sectors that are less adversely impacted. And if you look at job growth by by earnings group, you'll see that the lowest earning group, not surprisingly, has seen the biggest drop off in jobs that has not recovered, whereas the highest earning group, this is people like us faculty who have continued to work from home, most of us, and continue to earn our salaries. So very unequal impacts of this pandemic. And there's very unequal burdens of the pandemic as well in terms of the death rates. We see that whites have a death rate through August that is roughly half of that of blacks in this country. And I was intrigued by Professor Maddox's comments on empathy. My conjecture was that in the early part of the pandemic, that when the Georgia governor and Florida governor did not shut down their states, my view is it was because these governors recognized that most of the impact was going to be on African Americans, and quite frankly, I don't think they cared. But now that the pandemic has spread throughout the population into white Midwestern states, all of a sudden there's a lot more concern. And I'll be curious to see if there's any agreement with that conjecture. That's totally unscientific. The CARES Act, the big congressional package that passed, was enormously important. We saw a huge drop off in spending, and the CARES bump in income including the very generous unemployment benefits, were enormously important in helping to keep the economy from spiraling even further downward. And I really fear what's going to happen if we go down Professor Berry's very pessimistic road and get absolutely nothing going forward, including potentially a CARES 2 Act, which we desperately need. So that's the most immediate issue. Now let me just step back or step out and look at an even bigger, more long lived issue, and that's economic inequality in this country, which has grown dramatically over the past 40 years. We see income inequality in the sense, if you look at the earnings growth for the top 1%, it's more than tripled over this time period, whereas other groups, we don't see that kind of income growth. So we see huge disparities in income equality as well as wealth equality. And this is just reflected as well as in the share of income going to the top 10% of households. It's gone from about 1/3 to nearly 1/2. It's a huge problem. And I think with a Republican Senate, I don't think we're going to do much about it. But I think that also fuels some of the Trump populism that we need to address in this country. Last point is climate change, my area of work. This is an even sort of larger, more existential issue. We see carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere growing over time as the temperature has grown. So we're going from 1850 up to the present time. This has led to huge damages, wildfires in California, Hurricane Harvey flooding Houston, extreme temperatures. This is June of 2019, as well as droughts. These have huge damages already in our country and as well as globally. And the thing I'd like to point out about this is that the climate damages are quite unequally distributed. This simply ranks households from the poorest 10% to the richest 10% of households. And you see that not surprisingly, the poorest households are disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so that, I think there's a huge equity issue here as well. So let me close. And the big question is, what will Congress and President Biden be able to do on any of these really fundamentally significant issues? And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Oops, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much. Yeah, these, I kind of knew that part of the virtue of having an event like this is getting to hear this expertise on such a wide range of issues. And I don't think I was prepared myself for just how pessimistic I would feel as the time went on, hearing from all of you. And so to that end, Professor Warikoo, you're up next.
Thank you. Well, Debbie, thank you so much for inviting me onto this panel. And it's so great to hear from all of these new colleagues. 2020 is such a strange year to start a new job, but I look forward to meeting all of you in person one day. So on the one hand, I think I'm also extremely pessimistic about the impact of COVID-19 in particular on educational inequality. I think anyone who follows the news is very aware of what's happening. On the other hand, I am cautiously optimistic about the shifts that can happen. I think in a Biden administration, in his speech that Saturday night when the election was called, Joe Biden said, "For America's educators, this is a great day. You're going to have one of your own in the White House." And that, I have to say, as an educator, I had a moment of pure joy. For those who don't know, Jill Biden was a teacher for many years. She teaches in community college. She says she's going to continue teaching. This is unprecedented as First Lady. She has a doctorate in education. And it was a pleasant surprise to hear it in that speech, given how little education featured in the campaign, despite this incredibly disruptive moment in which millions of school children have not been in school since March. And so I'm hopeful that we're going to have a Secretary of Education who actually believes in public education and the importance of education as a tool for democracy and equal opportunity. So I'm going to say a little bit about kind of the federal role in education, and then I want to talk about our role as sort of faculty and what we need to do in higher education in this moment. So, let me just start out by saying Betsy DeVos, the current Secretary of Education, has spent 4 years in a role that she doesn't really believe in, right? She has been, she's not a fan of, federal involvement in education unless it's to provide public dollars for private education, for tutoring. She spent 4 years trying to decimate public education. She defended teachers bringing guns to school. She rescinded guidance on transgender students' rights, guidance on protecting students of color from unequal discipline practices. She focused on protecting those accused of sexual assault in higher education. She stopped protections for college students taking loans from these kind of for-profit colleges that were misleading. And I think perhaps, the most obvious is that she's done nothing on the pandemic and the impact on schools, besides saying that schools should open. And so I really think what we really need, and maybe anyone have the ear of Jill Biden, tell her this, that we need national leadership on how and when to open schools for in-person learning safely. And we need the resources to make that happen. School districts, cities are not going to have these resources, even if we have guidance on what to do. States, I doubt, are going to be able to provide this. We need this from the federal government. We need to see schools as essential organizations and school staff as essential workers. And if we do this, I think it's really important to start thinking about a tiered response to COVID in communities that really, really prioritizes schools. Business owners have their advocates in government. School children don't have their teachers have the unions. The school children don't really have their advocates. But I really think it takes, it's incredible, looking around the country at what school districts are doing, how diverse, how differently we are approaching this. And it's kind of nonsensical. We need federal guidance on here are the different conditions. When we have this rate of infection, when we have a population that has this percentage of essential workers, when we have a population that has this percentage of families living in intergenerational households, then we do this. We open the elementary schools, but not the high schools. We do part-time here, and just a very clear flow chart and guidance on what to do. That is evidence-based, that is looking at like a lot of data that we now have about some schools that are open, about what remote learning can be, and that has the financial resources and backing to meet those guidelines in under-resourced communities. And I think we need to do this in collaboration with communities so families can feel safe sending their kids to school, right? We know that families are choosing to go to school when it's available differently, and those are because families are experiencing differential impacts of the pandemic. And so I really think I am hopeful that a new Secretary of Education, a new Department of Education can do this. And my second point, the second thing that I think we desperately need in education, and to me this is less about the government and more about our role in education, is we need a strengthening of our democracy and an emphasis on facts and respectful engagement along lines of difference. I think we need it in higher ed. And I feel like if we can't figure out how to do this in higher education, our country I am very pessimistic about our country. And I think part of this is also, and Sarah, you brought this up earlier, is building an understanding of American history and the role that race has played. How, she talked about 2 centuries ago, even in the most recent period, 100 years, how seemingly race-neutral policies have systematically excluded people of color, especially African Americans. I'm very much in favor of a diversity course requirement. We have all of these distribution requirements in universities. It's kind of wild to me that we don't have these, that this is not more common.
I think when we talk about diversity and difference, we need to stop only talking about diversity and multiculturalism. We need to talk about equity, about justice, about a diverse leadership. And I think, the diversity talk in my own research and in my book, The Diversity Bargain, I show how, this language of diversity really kind of paralyzes white students, and it doesn't really help them understand the roots of racial injustice and inequality, and makes it hard for them to get behind more kind of restorative justice policies. And I think in our own classrooms, engaging around lines of difference, we need to figure out how to get this right. And, sometimes when I go on Twitter, I'm very pessimistic that we as faculty can even do it amongst each other. But I think that, we have a tradition of getting people in a room, talking about a text and disagreeing and talking about facts. And I feel like we've got to get this right. So I'll say I'm cautiously optimistic. I hope that our president-elect hits the ground running with an agenda for education that centers national guidance on opening schools safely with the financial resources to enact those policies. And I hope that we in higher education can really focus on strengthening our democracy in K-12 and higher education. And I think along with that very much comes an emphasis on race and a kind of racial reckoning. So I forgot to put my stopwatch on, so I hope I was not too long.
It was perfect. Thank you so much. And last but not least, we have Professor Michael Beckley.
Hey, thanks, Debbie. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'll keep my comments short because I'm talking about the US-China relationship. And the bottom line is I don't actually think America's China policy will change all that much under a Biden administration. Essentially, the policy is gearing up for great power competition. That's kind of the mantra in DC. And it's frankly one of the few bipartisan issues out there. And so I think that the three main pillars of US-China policy are going to continue. The first is this continual military buildup in the Asia Pacific. Essentially, the problem was China acquired all these missiles that could destroy US bases in Japan and on Guam. And so the United States is responding through what the Pentagon calls distributed lethality, which basically means lots more little bases and drones and submarines and ships, just create too many targets for China to wipe out and basically lay down a high-tech minefield that can, this is according to American doctrine, it's supposed to be able to sink most of China's Navy within 72 hours. The Biden administration has already endorsed that plan. The person who's gonna probably take over as the Secretary of Defense, Michelle Flournoy, just wrote an article for Foreign Affairs where she said that's fundamentally our goal in the Asia Pacific. The second pillar of US-China policy is basically forging a series of ad hoc anti-China alliances to kind of push back on China in select areas. And so there's a lot of talk of creating something that's basically like John McCain's old idea of a League of Democracies. Now Boris Johnson has proposed this thing called a D10, where you take the top 10 democracies and they're going to coordinate on things like securing 5G networks, protecting democratic elections. So the Biden team has already signaled it's going to try to pick up that mantle. And then also repurposing what used to be called the Quad, which is the United States, Japan, India, and Australia, to coordinate maritime security in East Asia. That has a lot of momentum behind it. And then there's just a series of bilateral partnerships with Vietnam, with the Philippines, and I think most notably with Taiwan, where there's a ton of pressure, especially on Capitol Hill, to actually increase America's commitment to Taiwan, to make it absolutely explicit that the United States would defend Taiwan if China attacked. I don't know if the Biden administration will back that, but I think they'll continue the policy of starting to send more US officials to Taiwan, continue to sell lots of arms to Taiwan, and conducting joint exercises. The third pillar that I think is going to continue is this sort of partial economic decoupling of the two countries. So, a lot of people, and I think the Biden team is on board with this, basically want to erect a tech iron curtain in select areas to block Chinese access to the crown jewels of US technological superiority. So that's especially things like semiconductors, AI chips, computer numerical control machines, basically things that would allow China to dominate what a lot of people see as the next wave of technology with artificial intelligence. And then the other aspect of this economic decoupling is trying to wean American dependence off of Chinese products in critical areas. You don't want to depend on China for linchpin goods. The Biden team has already signaled that it's going to try to find other suppliers for crucial things like medical supplies, because China just recently threatened to drown the United States in a sea of coronavirus by denying access to critical medical supplies. But it's also things like rare earths that China has a monopoly on. And so the United States, I think under Biden, is going to be trying to find alternative suppliers. So I think the bottom line is there's not going to be a reset. Biden himself has called President Xi Jinping a thug. He's called China's activities and its re-education camps in Xinjiang genocide. And he's explicitly vowed to get tough with China. His advisors actually wrote a very influential article in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago called The China Reckoning, which basically called the last 20 years of American China policy a failure and said the US coddled China for too long. It's time to get tough. Sorry, that's an internal timer I have. And on Capitol Hill, there's just a ton of pressure for getting tough with China, and even public opinion. I mean, negative views of China are literally at their highest, not just in the United States, but in many countries around the world now, since the Tiananmen Square massacre. So there's just so much momentum behind a much more competitive US-China relationship. I think the only major changes I would expect to see would be, first, a Biden team is going to put less emphasis on the trade balance. You know, Trump was willing to do things like drop tariffs if China was willing to buy, you know, a bunch of soybeans from farmers in red states that would help Trump's electoral prospects. The Biden team is much more focused on coercing structural change in China's economy, or failing that, trying to reduce US dependence on China's economy. So I actually think in some ways the US-China economic relationship could get even more competitive under a Biden administration. The second change would be select cooperation on certain transnational issues. So climate change could be one of them. Biden, the former deputy national security advisor under the Obama administration, who also worked with Biden, straight up just told me that they are planning to try to do some kind of olive branch on climate change with China, because he said not only is it the right thing to do for obvious reasons, but also it's always good to have these two countries working on at least one cooperative global endeavor, even as they compete in all these other areas. So I would expect to see that pretty early in the administration. The other possibility is cooperation on COVID and vaccine dispersal, but there, frankly, China hasn't really expressed a lot of desire to work with the United States. So I don't know if that's really in the cards. The last change I would expect is just more personal advocacy on behalf of the president, Biden as president, for American values as having a place in the US-China relationship. So more, be more outspoken on human rights. Because the Trump administration called out China for various human rights abuses, but Trump himself was largely silent on the issue. So I expect Biden himself to be leading the charge. I also think a Biden administration will do more to try to push back on China's influence in the UN, where it heads 4 of the 15 special agencies. It's basically been playing a lot of inside baseball and working, you know, getting its officials in high-ranking positions in the UN. Republican administrations don't care so much about the UN, so the Trump administration didn't really push back on that. But I think a Biden team is much more, you know, someone like Samantha Power is going to be much more willing to try to play that game. And then the last thing I think would be Biden is going to reduce some of these visa restrictions that the Trump administration was trying to hand down. There's a lot of talk in the Biden administration of trying to actually encourage more Chinese students to come study in the United States. So I think it's going to be largely the same with some changes around the margins. And this is just largely because this is what great powers do. I actually think the US-China relationship would have gotten more competitive had it not been for 9/11. You know, the George W. Bush administration was actually talking about doing a lot of the things the Trump administration ended up doing, but then 9/11 happened and you needed Chinese cooperation on counterterrorism and in the UN. And so that kind of caused the United States to take its eye off of China. But now with the United States pulling mostly out of the greater Middle East, I think, you know, China is going to remain front and center. And also, frankly, I think China has become a lot more repressive and aggressive over the last 10 years. And I can go into all the details about why that is. But, you know, I consider myself somewhat of a China dove, maybe 5 or 10 years ago. But even I feel in myself this transition to being more of a hawk, just because I think the regime has changed its own policies and has clearly signaled it's going to go down a much more repressive and aggressive path. So, you know, I wish I could have some kind of note of optimism to end this on, but I think US-China competition is very much going to be a focal point of US foreign policy under Biden.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for sticking with us through these overview remarks from everyone. It's kind of a whirlwind tour of some of the issues that are on the table. I will point out, though, from Camp Optimism, that pretty much all of you seem to assume that Biden will be the president come January 20th. So in my darker moments, I find myself not so sure. So, you know, hearing all this discussions about what's going to happen when he's president, you know, is a sign of the sense that that this is an unfortunate sideshow that may have long-term consequences, but that we will at least have Biden as president. Although if you want to comment on that and retract your assumption, we can have that as well. So for the time that we have left, this is for discussion. Panelists can ask questions of panelists. Anybody in the audience, you can either raise a virtual hand or post a question in the chat. I certainly have questions for everybody. We do have a question that came up from Haitong. Do you want to read us your question and ask your question to Professor Taliaferro?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm just trying to turn my video on. Lighting, thank you. Thank you everyone for the wonderful presentation. And this question is more directed toward Professor Taliaferro and Professor Beckley about Sino-US relations primarily. The regional comprehensive economic partnership was signed 5 days ago. Many people saw that as a move pushed forward by China in some way to marginalize or replace the TPP under Obama's pivot to Asia strategy. And the question for the both of you is, from a international relations perspective, do you see the Biden administration implementing some strategies similar to the ones that Obama tried to implement, or due to the presence of domestic oppositions, you'll be more hesitant to address the issues that Obama tried to address?
I would agree with what was said before, that certainly over the past 10 years and especially over the past 4 years, the one area in which Democrats and Republicans can seem to agree is that China is an adversary of the United States. So in that respect, I don't think that Biden would face the same type of pushback that Obama did. The problem, with Obama's pivot to Asia, later the rebalancing towards Asia, were two things. Number one, it's very difficult for a superpower to completely withdraw from one region and focus its attention and resources on a different region. As we saw, the United States got sucked back in to the Middle East because of the emergence of the Islamic State. And second, for all of the talk about the rebalancing towards Asia, it was largely that talk. There really wasn't a substantial commitment of resources to that. So do I think that the Biden administration will attempt to try to develop some type of trade framework to rival this new multilateral agreement that China has heralded? Yes, I do. I don't think they're going to face as much opposition as the Obama administration did with the TPP, simply because China is perceived as being a much greater threat now than it was 5 or 6 or now 10 years ago. I don't know whether Professor Beckley would like to add to that or disagree with me.
The only thing, I think all of that is correct. I think the only thing I would add is the Biden team is going to be constrained. I don't think they could just go and try to reconstitute American participation in TPP, because even the Democratic base, first of all, is not too keen on trade. If you remember, Clinton is the one that promoted TPP, and she had to basically rescind that on the campaign trail in 2016 because it was so unpopular with the Democratic base. And so I just don't think there's a lot of momentum behind signing more free trade deals at a time when the administration is talking about trying to help average American workers and protect them more from foreign competition. I also think it's interesting, this morning Xi Jinping actually said that China would be willing to maybe join the TPP as well. My sense, talking to national security folks, is that they are very skeptical of these agreements just because they think these agreements are not suited to root out a lot of the ways that China cheats on its WTO commitments. There's a lot of non-tariff barriers that aren't covered. There's a lot of intellectual property protections that aren't written in. And so it's just very hard to regulate China through something like these big trade deals. And so a better option is just the more coercive unilateral measures that the Trump administration has popularized. So I don't, for both domestic reasons and for international reasons, I would say it's less likely that the Biden administration is going to try to push back by signing some region-wide trade agreement.
Thank you so much. Professor Berry.
Yes, I wanted to get Gib to talk some about how much Biden can do through the regulatory process to promote climate change, because Trump did an awful lot of damage through administrative rules that he issued at EPA, Interior, and so on. Is there a cause for optimism on that front? Because I don't think anything's going to go through Congress.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, and I agree with that, and also with what Professor Maddox said in the chat about Biden not being allowed to have the chance to hit the ground running. The whole delegitimizing of the election, I think, is going to do serious damage in Congress for anything Biden can do. But there's a lot. The one good thing about the Trump administration is that they were singularly inept in undoing the regulatory rules that had been put in place under previous administrations, under Obama. And that means that there's less to roll back than they might otherwise have had to do had he been more adept at it. But we're going to see if we have to go the administrative route, we're going to see action through the Clean Power Plan, for which carbon dioxide is still a criteria pollutant. We're going to see a Clean Power Plan 2. It'll be different from what Obama had put forward, but we'll see some action there. That will get challenged in the courts, to be sure, and that's challenging with an increasingly conservative judiciary. But I think there's some scope there. We'll see that there'll be no more leasing on federal lands for oil and gas leases, and I think there'll be significant roadblocks put up in terms of existing leases, even if they can't prevent drilling. They can certainly make it more difficult, and a considerable amount of oil, gas, and coal production comes off of federal property. And I think the third area which we'll see significant action is through fuel economy standards. CAFE is we're going to return to the deal that had been struck between Detroit and the Obama administration in 2011 to significantly ratchet up fuel economy standards, and that will encourage the increasing electrification of the vehicle fleet. So we're going to do a lot, and I think there will be agreement between Congress and the administration on spending for R&D, and so I think we'll see some of that. So it'll be less efficient, it'll be more awkward and cumbersome, and probably more expensive to do these administrative type approaches, as opposed to doing something like a national carbon price, which is obviously my preference. But I think we will see action, and also I think returning to the Paris Agreement is going to be and the other multilateral agreements is going to be incredibly important for returning us, maybe not to the same level of significance and influence in the international negotiations and putting pressure on other countries to reduce emissions, but I think it's moving in the right direction. The big emissions growth is in Africa, India, and they're going to need our help, but they're not going to do anything if we continue to do what was happening under the Trump administration. I could say a lot more, but I won't.
Thank you. Professor Berry, why don't you keep the floor and address Keith's question about why should we be comfortable in this idea that Biden will be president on January 20th?
I will. I'll talk about that. And I think, first of all, I think our system is much more resilient and committed to democratic ideals than in 1876 that Sarah talked about, and where there was a real fraud in terms of a deal that was made that made Rutherford Hayes president of the United States when he didn't deserve to be. I think Biden is going to be elected because the courts are very hesitant to overturn elections. So that would be a very broad reach. And we've seen that virtually every case that the Republicans have brought before the courts have been thrown out. So even if there's a state that doesn't certify the election in the way that was carried in terms of what the vote was, that would end up back in the courts, and the courts will rule in favor of the state's initial count. So I'm not concerned about Biden becoming president, but I do think, to use Gibbs' phraseology, there is a delegitimization of the election, and I think that is serious, and it's going to be something that the Republicans are going to use, and there'll be competition in Republican primaries to who is most committed to that ideal. So I think that is a real problem, and that disturbs me.
I don't know if that makes you feel better or worse, Professor Maddox, but short-term, long-term issues.
I was going to say it does make me feel better, but I think, you know, just again, a lot of the implications that people are talking about, like there's been a lot of damage that's been done, and we're going to be dealing with it, and in the context of trying to make progress on other fronts, and I'm pessimistic about that because there's too much to do to fix before we can actually start to move forward.
And I see Professor Uri put in the chat about faithless electors, which we know that the Supreme Court has upheld the ability of faithless electors to be punished, but that punishment doesn't change their vote. It just, you know, imposes a fine on them for having been faithless. So yeah, I would, you know, and again, in my darker moments, I think it's not a 0% chance that these efforts will succeed, but it's low, but it's not zero, is my current take on that. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
May I pick up on something? You know, I don't think that there's going to be a problem with Biden and Harris being inaugurated on January 20th. What I am concerned about, and it's a concern every presidential election, every time there's a change of party, but I'm especially concerned this year, given what we've been through, is staffing the administration. You know, the presidents appoint roughly 4,000 executive branch officials. And of those, roughly 1,200 are subject to Senate confirmation. And if the Republicans control the Senate, which I think is very likely, extraordinarily likely, I think that's going to constrain Biden's ability to put certain people in senior administration positions. You know, Susan Rice's name gets floated every once in a while as a potential nominee for Secretary of State. If the Republicans control the Senate, that's a non-starter. That's just a non-starter. They managed to demonize her because of, you know, the Benghazi incident in 2011, and also given the way that Mitch McConnell runs the Senate as a majority leader, I would imagine that it's going to be very difficult for Biden to get any judicial nominees through. And it might be very difficult for him to get sub-cabinet appointments through in a timely manner.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Shane Woolley.
Do I say it out loud?
Yes, please go ahead.
Sure. Actually, I was going to ask a question about the Dems' chances or whatever's going to happen in 2022, 2024. I think maybe a more interesting question is about like devolution of regional power as federal gridlock probably will continue in 2022, 2024, et cetera. And like, especially in response to COVID, we've seen a lot of that, like pacts between states to control travel and stuff like that. I feel like we could see this for climate change especially, but does anybody have any thoughts about that?
Anyone want to take that one? Yeah, go ahead.
Educate, if that's going to happen in any field, it would happen in education. And we're not really, I mean, state governments have not been much better than the federal government in kind of figuring out how to deal with COVID, at least, you know, and at least in education. I mean, even in liberal Massachusetts, I mean, we have a very centrist Republican governor, very little guidance. School districts, you know, 10 miles down the road from each other doing very different things. So I don't know that, at least in education, I'm not seeing that happen. And education is the one domain in which like states are much more powerful than the federal government historically. But I don't know, in other domains, I'd love to hear others' thoughts on this question.
Well, certainly in my area on immigration, which is one area where we didn't have an explicit dedication on this panel, but even, well before Trump, the state level activity on immigration was just through the roof after the two, Congress couldn't agree on anything. And so I see no reason that that would slow down in this upcoming administration, particularly if Democrats don't get the Senate. So things like increasing, and particularly with, backlash against things that the Trump administration has done on immigration. So you may see more, experimentation or activity locally with regard to things like sanctuary cities and that type of thing. But that's something that precedes Trump even. But I wouldn't see any reason for that to be slowing down in terms of states doing their own thing in face of congressional inaction. Professor Marrow.
Hi. I wanted to ask a question, that I think it's inspired by Sarah's presentation, in that, if I read that presentation correctly, we're possibly in a second, maybe third redemption era that's going to be with us for a while, even if Biden is installed, which I think is likely. We've heard today, including from Jeff, that even if that happens, there's still really, a lot of support for the Republican Party, and that there may not be a lot of progress in certain fronts these next couple of years, and that we're kind of here in this period for a long time. So if that's the case, and I'm projecting, what can help us? Like, what can save us? I think from a lot of the violence and the inequality that we're here. And I guess it was inspired too. I also heard Debbie respond to that, saying that, I think your comment was that it's comforting to know that we've been here before and the Republic has survived, even if it's uncomfortable. But sure, the country survived, but at great cost. I mean, at really great cost. And I'm really concerned about a lot of the costs that we're looking at right now, and what can help us avoid some of those.
I can speak to that. Thanks so much. I think, yes, you are reading into what I was suggesting in my comments, that I do think that we are not entering into, but actually in the middle of a really serious convulsion over the sort of political racial identity of the nation, akin to what was happening in the Reconstruction and Redemption eras. And I think, to kind of come to your question in sort of a roundabout way, I think one of the things that we can do and have been doing is to, like I said, teach about race in the United States and teach about its colonial history and its racial history. And I think that actually, the 40 plus years of teaching since ethnic studies departments began to appear in universities is actually part of what has created this moment. And what I mean by that is, when I look around these days on social media, in the news, in opinion editorials, I see so much language about intersectionality and racial identity and settler colonialism that really comes out of, the activist and organizing work of women of color, feminists, of Indigenous activists, Black activists, that were then sort of incorporated into the university setting through ethnic studies departments and have been sort of disseminated to a generation or so of university students who then, take that with them into their activism and their organizing, their professional lives, and so forth. And so I see this sort of trickle up and trickle down sort of language that is associated with ethnic studies departments that is now sort of permeating a much wider public. And when I look at the sort of reactionary and regressive language of people who align themselves with Trump and the Republican Party, a lot of what they are reacting to is that very language and those frameworks and those ways of seeing the world and the relationships that shape the United States. So I think that a lot of ways, and this is not a direct causality, but it's sort of my understanding of the broad milieu that we're in, is that a lot of the reaction that people who align themselves with Trump and the Republican Party, I think they are actually reacting to humanistic and social science studies about race and the way that that is actually starting to reshape politics and social life on a broader level. And I think we need to continue to do that work, right? We're in this moment where the heat of that kind of teaching and critical awareness and thinking has come to a point where a broad public is reacting to it. And there's a lot of energy for that sort of work to continue, for that sort of anti-racist, anti-colonial work to continue. And there is, of course, the backlash to it. And so, this sort of goes back to a question that Debbie asked me about when we were preparing for this is, where do Trump's executive orders fit into this? I think that, that executive order is responding to what I'm talking about now, right? This recognition on the part of the right and the conservative sort of wing of American politics that there is actually something threatening about ethnic studies, critical race studies, to this vision of the nation as a nation of white men. And so I think, continuing to teach those things is, I think, actually really critical. I know it doesn't do very much to ameliorate the sort of immediate harms that people are facing in terms of, disease, houselessness, joblessness, etc. But I think that if we are, in my understanding, in the midst of a sort of like generational convulsion, I think that continuing to teach about these things is what is going to give our students the tools and the understanding to actually envision other kinds of relationships, which are going to be what I think gets us out of this in the long run.
Great, thank you. And to Helen, I mentioned comfort mixed with profound depression at what we see happening today. And in terms, and on that point, thinking about you mentioned, Sarah, that the reaction of Trump and the Republican Party to the phenomena that you're mentioning. What I'm also thinking about is, the election night was barely over, where among Democrats themselves, should we not use the phrase defund the police? Did we align ourselves too much with the cause of racial justice? And this, that's where the, really thinking about the parallels with 1876 is they're going to be in thinking about ahead immediately to 2022, this sense of we can't go there because it backfired and hurt us in 2020. So let's abandon that on the left in the Democratic Party. And I think in a number of places, that's going to be the lesson they're going to take from what happened in 2020.
Yeah, and it's a dangerous lesson, right? Because I think as soon as we concede any power on that, whether it's political power, moral, ground, I think that there is a risk that then there becomes a vacuum for, sort of regressive reactionary forces to say, look, even they don't really believe in what they were saying. So I think it is a dangerous compromise. And, I'm not a political scientist, as so many people here are, and can't speak to sort of the mechanics of compromise between parties. But I think on a sort of broad level, the question of how much to compromise on those commitments is a really important one and will shape, the next decades.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Sarah, can I add to, ask a related question, Debbie?
Yeah, of course.
Because this is something, I've been thinking about a lot. So I appreciate your perspective, Sarah. But I would love to hear your thoughts on, like, how do we do this in a country in which, like, I even think like school districts and district leaders and teachers have such different worldviews? Like, do we just say, well, we're just gonna like do this work and support, teaching and learning in places where people are kind of on board and empathetic, and like stop worrying about like, the other side or those who sort of agree with like we shouldn't be talking about critical race theory or what? How do you sort of, I feel like that's a huge hump. And when I think of that 70 million, I think like, and I think there's a disproportionate number of
educators who are not in that camp, but there are plenty of educators who are in that camp. And then I think, well, I don't know how we do this when, you know, we don't even share, like, even among educators, basic ideas about facts. And I don't know, thought about that.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and I have sort of a response, and then I'm actually curious if maybe Keith has something to say on this, because I actually think that the question of empathy is really central to the kind of critical awareness that like an ethnic studies you know, teacher would try to foster in students, right? In addition to an awareness of US history, an ethic of empathy, right? And sort of responsibility to others. But I think it is an interesting question, just to speak really quickly to the question of like curriculum, right? What is required to teach? In California right now, the state of California is going through a sort of prolonged struggle to try to institute an ethnic studies curriculum as part of the state's required courses, you know, throughout primary, secondary, and middle education. And it's a real struggle because the sort of core tenets of ethnic studies fields tend to be pretty oppositional to the state itself. And so watching them, or if not oppositional, at least critiquing the state very heavily as sort of the purveyor of racial violence and colonial relationships. And so watching the state of California try to write a curriculum that, you know, has integrity to what ethnic studies is about, while also opening it up to public comment to people on all parts of the political spectrum, right? Even people who you might think would be aligned with this sort of ethnic studies project are really unhappy with some of the ideas that are central to the idea of ethnic studies. And so it is interesting, to your point about, you know, curriculum and education being run at the state and local level, of watching the state of California try to figure out, how do we get people who are on all sides of the political spectrum and who may or may not believe in or care about the project of racial justice, how do we get them to sign on to a curriculum that everyone is then required to teach? And one of the questions is, how do you get people to teach these curriculums when they may be themselves openly hostile to the material? So I don't know the answer to that, but I know that the state of California is struggling with that right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything great to add, other than to be honest, sometimes around these kinds of issues, I find myself thinking a little bit more like what I think an economist might think like, in the sense that you know, for the most part, people do what they want to do, whether it's rational or not. They're gonna come up with a rationale, and they're really driven. A lot of their behavior and their actions are driven by their motivations and their desires and their needs. And to the extent to which you can align their motivations, their values with the goals of any particular endeavor towards change, you're going to be a little bit more successful in getting people to move in that direction. And the economist side of me, or sorry, I don't have an economist side, forgive me, but you know, the part of me that thinks, uses economic terms, is this idea of, like, you know, creating incentives to align them, right, to align incentives. So to the extent to which, you know, some of the work that I do presentations with Sam Summers, where we talk about, you know, the concept of implicit bias. And what we're trying to do is sort of raise awareness around the idea of implicit bias, which in shorthand is basically that, you know, even if you think you're egalitarian, there are still some sort of unconscious factors that can influence your judgments and behaviors in the direction of negative, you know, having negative implications for how you see other people. And that's not all a bias. Not everybody is characterized as, you know, with respect to implicit bias, in the same sense that we start to think about the ways in which we think about explicit bias. So we have people who we consider as being racist and sexist and homophobic, and so explicit bias exists. Implicit bias is sort of another layer of it that just seems to encompass more people. But, you know, so raising awareness about that particular issue, maybe to get to the education part, we're not necessarily trying to change people's implicit bias, right? And I think a lot of times people think that that's what we're after. What we're trying to do is raise awareness around the idea that it helps, that it contributes to your judgments. And what we're hoping to do is raise people's sort of egalitarian motivations to want to do things right, to change the nature of how things work in the organization, or change the nature of how they might act and interact towards other people, so that they explore the kinds of strategies or interventions that they might not have thought of before, right? If you think that, that racism is a bad apple problem, then you're going to look towards getting rid of the bad apples. But if you think racism is a barrel problem, then you'll focus on changing the barrel, right? Doing something about the barrel, the context, the structure. So the idea is to raise awareness, to get people in line with their egalitarian motivations to try to do the kinds of things they might not have thought about before that could be useful and effective. And I often think that sometimes people really do want to do that, but they're not always motivated by their egalitarian values, right? They're often motivated by profit. And here's the economist part. If you can try to align, and this sounds cynical, but it's maybe true, if you can align diversity and inclusion efforts with profit motivations, then you're going to see more movement in those directions. And I guess I am curious as to whether or not that sort of, again, that sort of like lay perspective that I have about that maybe is characteristic. To what extent do people see racial and ethnic sort of equity as being aligned with the profit motivations of corporations and other entities? To what extent is climate change and efforts to try to curb it aligned with the profit motivations of organizations that might have actions that might impact the climate negatively? And to what extent is alignment of motivations, right, in this case, the profit motivation with some of these more social justice oriented motivations? How is that potentially successful, and are there examples in which it actually has led to change? So I didn't really answer the question. I just kind of asked another one.
So if I can just jump in
yeah.
on Keith's point, just since he invoked economics,
yeah.
What's striking about the strengths of Trump's base is that they are acting against their own economic interest in so many cases. In terms of universal health care or just greater healthcare access, in terms of cleaning up environmental pollution that disproportionately impacts lower income families. There are just tons of examples, and I just, I've always been struck by Arlie Hochschild's book. I think it's called Strangers in Their Own Land, which tells this story so vividly. So economics doesn't always win out. And I actually asked a question in the chat raising this issue of Isabel Wilkerson's framing of race as a caste issue, and just wondering if this helps us understand the Trump base a little bit better. And in my very simplistic world of thinking about it, you don't want to be at the bottom of the heap. So if you can make blacks at the bottom of the heap and keep them there, no matter how bad your situation is, well, at least you're not at the bottom of the heap. And to the extent that that's true, that strikes me as making this issue of race relations even more difficult to address. But I'd be curious for others' thoughts.
If I can jump in for a second, I think that is a really useful frame for thinking about it. To sort of think about the entanglements of race and class, right? Some scholars of race in US history, so like David Roediger and W.E.B. Du Bois, talk about what they call the psychological wages of whiteness, right? So this idea that poor and working class white people, particularly in the Civil War period that I was talking about, were sold this lie of whiteness as a way of affiliating with elite land-owning white Southerners, right? So the elite land-owning class, and there's historical evidence of this, sold this story of we are more alike than we are different in our racial identity than we are different in our class position, right? So it was a way of sort of trying to tamp down and mitigate cross-racial alliances amongst poor and working class Black and white people. And David Roediger and W.E.B. Du Bois argue that this creates what they call this psychological wage of whiteness, that even if I am poor, at least I am not Black, for poor and working class Southern whites. And so I think that continues to show up in exactly what you're talking about now, of seeing some Trump voters voting against their economic interest in order to maintain this illusion of sameness with white elites who actually do not share their class interests.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that, I think that's the idea that we'll put it this way. I think I'm interested in casting a broad net when it comes to different types of interventions and opportunities to affect change, and that different people are going to be motivated in different ways. And so, you know, some people, social justice, egalitarian motivation, then that's great. We should have interventions that focus on those individuals. Some people or organizations might have economic motivations, so we should have interventions that try to align those motives. But then, you know, there may be other types of motivations, but the general idea is that if we can think about what those might be, then we can design some type of intervention in order to target those people. And with respect to the Trump voters, I think there is absolutely the idea of scapegoating, that you know, when something's going wrong, you want to find somebody else to blame. So that's not you. You often also want to maintain your sense of self in the status hierarchy, and that there are other groups that you could derogate in order to do that. There's strong sort of personal and group-based motivations to do that. And then to sort of get at the idea of what a Trump voter, oftentimes what people will invoke is this idea that, you know, when you start to think about values such as like the values having to do with meritocracy, and that you can, you know, work hard in this context and pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and that decreases sort of the emphasis that the context or the situation has in terms of an individual person's ability to make progress in a society. The idea and the belief in meritocracy is something that helps to help individuals identify with somebody like Donald Trump. I think in some ways you see some characteristics of that person that are similar, that when elitists sort of talk, and I say elitist, I kind of want to step back from that, but people who are perceived as elitist might look at Donald Trump's more boorish characteristics and qualities. And when you deride those characteristics and qualities and tell people that that's not what a president looks like, in some ways you're trying to tell them that they can't be president, right? Because they see themselves in him. And when you're doing that, you're also sort of, you know, by poking fun at him, you're also poking fun at them. And I think to the extent to which they see that, it may speak to that sense of meritocracy, that you're trying to tell them that because of who they are or the things in which they're similar to Donald Trump, there are ways in which they could not make the kinds of advances that they perceive that he's made in this society. And so then you're indirectly poking fun at them. And I think in a lot of ways, that's something that, you know, gets at people's core sense of their own selves, and may help to explain some of the ways in which they rally around this person that in a lot of different ways they dislike, but they say things about liking his policies. But I think there are a lot of other people that identify with him as a winner, right? He's a kind of a winner and the kind of person that they would like to be at some point. And they may see characteristics in him that are almost like a role model, that there are things about them that are similar, that they could make it if he makes it. And all of those kinds of beliefs, I think, you know, feed into when we poke fun at Trump, and the ways in which we might deride him might help to circle the wagons amongst his supporters to make them feel even more more resigned to support him.
Thank you. Professor Shevel, you had a question waiting for a while. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, in a way, I think this conversation was actually very helpful, because it kind of, my question, I mean, again, maybe a little bit naive, not studying American politics. And I'm actually now thinking, even within the comparative politics and American politics, kind of the series of two-party systems, right, that there should be this convergence in the middle. So in other words, this kind of divisive rhetoric, right, that appealing to these like really, you know, extremes either on the left or on the right is not even a strategic choice, right, by a party in a two-party system. And yet, I mean, at least from my understanding, the Republican Party is doing exactly that, right? And they're not actually taking the opportunity to distance themselves from Trump and to try to appeal to kind of more moderate, you know, middle of the political spectrum. And I'm kind of trying to understand, like, why is that? Like, is it a conscious choice the Republican Party has made? And maybe, you know, people who study American politics could enlighten me on this. Or is there some sort of like, can we expect it to change? I mean, it seems like now the prime opportunity, right? Like, I mean, why like going away with going to back the claims that elections were stolen when they were not, like how much worse can it get, right? Like it's really, and yet we don't see en masse kind of condemnation of this, right? And the party, I mean, that's another thing that sort of puzzles me, studying region with very unstable political parties that actually don't have ideological basis. That's oftentimes it's some like oligarchs or some, you know, in my country, a comedian is president, right? Like there are boxers presidents and things like that. So that, but the Republican Party does have a strong set of ideology, right? About, you know, free market and, you know, all of these things that they could build on instead of this divisiveness and kind of conspiratorial thinking, and they don't. And I just really kind of puzzled by this. Like, I would be interested to hear more from, you know, colleagues who have some insight on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a quick take and then I'll hand it over to Jeff. I mean, one book that I've read a few years ago that it's kind of, I call it my universal theory of everything in American politics, is Frances Lee's Insecure Majorities, where one of the things she documents is the era of that having each election every 2 years, the majority hanging in the balance. Is something that we just really haven't experienced in modern American political history. So if you look at the past 150 years, you had a long stretch where it was clear that one party was going to have the majority. And then now we're in an era where every single election, it seems like it could flip. And the consequences of that, of being able to cede anything to the other side, has been profound. It does seem like it's asymmetric, where it happens more on the right than on the left. And I'm not sure I have a great explanation for that, except for you know, over that same time period, you know, in political psychology circles, you see an increasing correlation between things like support for measures of authoritarian predispositions and partisanship. And so this idea of willingness to use kind of undemocratic measures to maintain stability and order is also aligning more with the right, at the same time that you have these unstable majorities. And so the sense of, you know, if you give any compromise to the other side, that diminishes your chance of getting the majority back, combined with that alignment of things like authoritarian predispositions and partisanship, might be a part of the story. So I don't know, what do you think, Jeff?
Well, I agree with all of that, and I love that your universal book, Frances Lee's book. She contradicted herself in this morning's New York Times. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, either the Times or the Post, I don't remember. She says bipartisanship is actually possible. So I didn't agree with it. So Oxana, for somebody who studies comparative politics, I think you actually have a pretty good understanding of American politics. And you're right, the two-party system is at the heart of this problem. There's a lot more continuity on the Republican side than there is difference. So Trump, yes, he's unique, but this goes all the way back to Richard Nixon. And the structural problem is that Republican candidates come from Republican primaries. And that's a very small segment of American society, but it's very conservative, it's very white, it's becoming less diverse, not more diverse, even though America is becoming diverse. And so there's this continuity of white working class Christians and white businessmen who coalesce, and they appoint or they nominate people that are committed to low taxes, free markets, and race baiting. And there are elections to be won by promoting those. And that hasn't changed, and it doesn't look like it's going to change. And the reason why Trump has been so successful as cowing other Republicans is because of the primaries, that he can go to a primary and anoint somebody as the Trumpy, the Trump preference. And he's had a very good record. He hasn't won every Republican primary where he's said who his preference is, but most of them. So that's not going away. And
even though they have to then appeal to the voters kind of more broadly in the election to even
get but you answered your question. There's only two parties. So you want to throw the rascals out, there's only one other party to put in. And that's not going to change either, because the system, to use Trump's word, is rigged to favor an oligopoly of political parties. Two.
So I have one question, and then I'll turn it over to Natasha. I see you have posted some thoughts in the chat too. My question is for both for Keith and for Jeff, and this is on the possibilities for national leadership. So, you know, we know from tons of political science research and public opinion research that leaders can really shape public opinion, and they can, you know, people will follow the leader, people will adopt the perspective of the party they align with, they will change their views to align with the party and from the messages of their leaders. So I'm thinking back to my own comments about the, you know, internal debates within the Democratic Party about how much to campaign and advocate for racial justice with their fear that this will lead them to lose elections. We know that leaders can get public opinion on their side. So first, is there an opportunity for the Democrats to do that? And then second, thinking about the idea of empathy in response to COVID, that, you know, I was being interviewed the other day by a journalist who was asking me about American identity and like, can we have this appeal to American identity once Biden is in office, to have this kind of national movement to fight COVID the way you would, you know, like have mobilization during wartime and a rally around the flag and this sense of national solidarity. And I think we had an opportunity for that, but I think this point on leadership, Trump showed that, you know, you can lead public opinion to now politicize this issue and undercut that opportunity. So I'm wondering about your thoughts of, can that opportunity come back now that it's been politicized? Can we have this sense of like national solidarity? So I know I've got multiple issues and questions in there, but it's basically for both of you, it comes down to this question of kind of elite messaging to move attitudes on these issues.
To Natasha. Natasha, did you want to talk?
So on this issue, or I'm confused.
I can't remember who Debbie said she wanted to talk.
No, so this is, I'm sorry, this is for you, Jeff, and for Keith, and then we'll go to Natasha's question after that.
So I'll go first and then defer to Professor Maddox, Professor Keith. I think that presidents can affect public opinion at the margins. I don't think they dramatically affect public opinion because there's just too much built-in opposition and there's not much of a middle anymore. But I do think that Joe Biden has the opportunity, particularly on race, to at least teach people how, remind people what is respectful language and how we should talk about each other. And I think it'll be beneficial to the country to have what's going to be a very diverse cabinet and staff. But he's not going to dramatically change race relations. I think the challenge for Biden is to reassure people of color, while at the same time not chasing whites out of the Democratic Party who might be become resentful of what they see as affirmative action. So that's no small challenge. I'm not sure he's up to it. He's not a great messenger, but his heart is in the right place. And so what we've elected is somebody who's very decent, even if he doesn't pull us in as much as we'd like. I do think he'll say the right things.
Yeah, I think I would kind of agree, I do agree, in part because I start to think about sort of what I think, why 2016 happened. And I think a lot of it was in reaction to the Obama years. And, you know, not just because Trump is very explicit about that, but I think he was able to take advantage of people's, you know, sense that there were too many strides, too much progress during those years, right? In terms of gay marriage, in terms of racial and ethnic sort of justice and equity. And while you would ask people who were, you know, who might find themselves in the, you know, in the trenches, so to speak, in some of those sort of questions and debate, there wasn't enough progress. But I think what we saw was a lot of backlash towards the progress that was there. But having said that, I think if people are going to, in order to move forward, I think there's always going to be a little bit of push and pull, I think, as maybe Professor Fong sort of described in her presentation, that there's going to be pushback and that progress, at least the way I think about progress in terms of change towards justice, is going to be a little bit more gradual, and we will have to deal with some of these plateaus and drops and dips. But Biden does have the opportunity, because I think one of the ways in which this kind of change happens is, and again, sort of speaking to the, maybe getting to Professor Warikoo's comments around education, just raising the rhetoric, getting people to talk about things that they normally weren't talking about before, having you know, a requirement in a classroom or at a university in order to learn about these kinds of issues. It gives you insight into things that you hadn't considered once before. And then those individuals go out and use, to some extent, maybe not always, but to some extent, they use that rhetoric, they use insights from those courses that they take in college or other places in society where that kind of conversation is taking place, and it informs their actions in other ways. So we start to see that, you know, these efforts towards education, these efforts towards exposure can be beneficial in changing our long-term ideas and attitudes. I think, you know, one thing that I've been, to kind of jump a little bit off of this particular topic, but one of the ways that I've been kind of shocked that I've sort of noticed change with respect to, you know, the people that are in commercials. Since we've been talking a little bit more about race, I'm not sure if anybody else has noticed, and I haven't seen any data on this, but there are a lot more commercials that have, for example, interracial couples, right? There'll be a Black mom and a white dad, and the children will be somewhat racially sort of ambiguous, if not somewhat mixed, right? The implication is that they are a blended family from perspective of race and ethnicity. And so there are ways in which the context is going to start to make things look a little bit more normal, and things that maybe not have been seen or perceived as being normal in the past. And I think what it does is that it actually feeds into the data that people have, where they're making judgments about others, where they're factoring or considering the kinds of thoughts and beliefs they have about others. And if we can change the context, change the data that people are taking in It's going to change the nature of the kinds of judgments that they have. And that includes sort of, the attitudes that they may have around race, around sexual orientation, around lots of other issues having to do with social justice. So I think the path forward really is to raise the rhetoric around these kinds of issues, to hopefully get people using the same language and having similar goals. And that's not always going to happen. But to the extent to which we can start to see change in the context and the environments in which we live and work and play, those things are going to eventually have changes or have impacts on our attitudes and ultimately our endorsement for the kinds of programs and policies that we need in order to get closer to equity.
Yes, Professor Warikoo.
So, Professor Maddox, I totally agree with you. I think that we haven't really talked about kind of media and both like traditional media, advertising, and social media. But I think this is a huge, and hugely important. And I think I completely agree with you that the depictions of families have shifted. The depictions of women in advertising is like remarkable. I go to Target and I'm like, and it's funny because I pointed this out to my teenager and she just thinks it's not a big deal to see a woman who's probably more average in the United States, so it shouldn't be unusual. But 10 years ago, we never saw those kinds of images, and I think they have an impact. And I also worry that we're consuming such different sources of information in the country. I mean, I think Fox News has like mastered this, and it's and has through that really shaped the way that people talk and think about issues. Social media, I think, is playing such an important role in and often disturbing role in terms of how people are understanding how the world works. And to get back to this question of like shared understandings and an understanding of history, I think all of this is being shaped by these I think particularly in young people, by these kind of echo chambers that they're a part of. So I also am worried about that. And I think as academics, we need to figure out how do we get this right? And how do we, I think, Twitter and Facebook and all, they suddenly are finally realizing the incredible power that they have and the damage that they can do. And I don't know if right now it feels like too little too late from them, frankly. But I actually wanted to raise this question of immigration, and Debbie, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, and I have my own musings. But I feel like even 10 years ago, I remember going to a talk by Dowell Myers and talking about this dramatic change that's about to happen because the electorate is changing, and there's this sort of demographic destiny and I think that's just not at all what we're seeing. I think we're seeing, there is this very white, kind of hyper masculine sort of party that some people of color, I think, are kind of becoming a part of. And that, the Democratic Party is certainly more diverse. And anyway, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on immigration and how is immigration shaping the electorate? How it's clearly not, we can't necessarily count on immigrants to vote, to be on the left for a whole host of reasons. And I would love to hear your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, so as you're talking, I'm bringing up some slides from when I taught public opinion. I was teaching Introduction to American Politics during the 2016 election. And there are two slides that I show in that class that I'm going to try to share that I think something that it's one slide, but that I wish, was better understood out there. So I'm just going to try to share this, and here we go. So I assume you can all see this. This is from, this was from the Washington Post, but it's from data that comes from Gallup and Pew. And this is looking at favorability ratings of Clinton and Trump just before the 2016 election among Hispanic immigrants and looking at by nativity and by language use. And I always tell my students, when you see bar graphs, kind of do the squint test and so what's the story that comes at you from these graphs. And what the story that comes at you is these are really different pictures depending on whether you are looking at people people who are immigrants versus people who are US born in terms of their evaluations of Trump versus Clinton in 2016. That's in the top graph. And in the bottom graph, you're looking by language use. And there's huge differences here. And, you know, there's on the data, I think, is somewhat mixed. I've seen some data suggesting that, you know, people who are more acculturated might be more likely to vote. They're certainly more likely to be citizens. People who are English dominant might be more in tune with most of the campaign discourse and that sort of thing. But at the same time, a lot of times, you know, immigrants might be more motivated to vote. They're feeling more, you know, using their opportunity to vote in the U.S. For the first time, for example. But I think these pictures are really striking, and it's just really important to this point that the assumption that demography is destiny is very complicated, that candidates don't run and campaigns don't happen in a vacuum. There's always the other side that you're running against and what their messages is and what their stances are, but that there are also real differences by nativity and language use. And this is looking just among Hispanic respondents as a whole. This isn't even breaking it down by national origin. But yeah, I mean, Hispanic voters who are born in the U.S. and who are English dominant look very different from Spanish voters who are Spanish dominant and who are first generation. So, you know, I think those pictures say a lot about what's underlying your question. And this goes back to the whole discussion of caste that we had earlier. And there's, you know, we know that the census treats race and ethnicity as separate questions. So on top of the national origin differences and the generational differences and the language use differences, you also have racial differences and whether people are racialized as white or as Black happening as well, that create different incentives and opportunities. So, and that's where campaigning and messaging can come in. I think it'll be a long time till we know for sure what exactly the story is with, say, Latino voters. But from at least what I hear, you know, I didn't see much of what was going on in Florida, for example, but that a big part of Trump's messaging was anti-socialism and how much of that was so there's, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity for Democrats with racial diversity, but it's not something that's just going to happen.
Yeah, I kind of wonder with those data, I would like to know a little more about. So the first thing that crosses my mind with respect to immigrants versus U.S.-born minorities is the extent to which, you know, so I talked a little bit about sort of like these ideas around meritocracy, and that there's another idea in psychology about status and whether people may have tendencies towards sort of retaining the status quo versus upending it. So whether or not they like the existing hierarchy that's there and whether they'd like to, you know, deconstruct it or to enhance and support it. And I kind of wonder whether people who are here maybe in some ways sort of have something that they are threatened by losing. So as Clinton and the policies that Clinton talks about perhaps are a little bit more likely to upend sort of the hierarchy and upend the status quo, and that is not necessarily beneficial for somebody who's sort of embedded in the system already, but for someone who's new to the system, it sounds like it's an attractive idea that you're going to try to create more and more opportunity for me. And that to some extent, maybe there are some slight differences between people who are immigrants who have basically very little but a lot to gain versus others who maybe have established themselves to some extent and have more to lose. And the idea is that those messages, the same message might be interpreted in very different ways and might lead to the kind of, you know, the disparate reaction you're talking about.
And I have two additional thoughts. One is that it'll be talking about how the candidates are not just kind of campaigning in a vacuum. They're in a context, they have issues, they have opponents. If you think about what role immigration played in the 2016 election versus what role it played in the 2020 election, it almost never came up in the debates at all. You didn't see the advertising with it. So what role that had in changing the racial and ethnic voting patterns in 2020 versus in previous years is something we need to study. And then finally, we know, you know, from looking, say, at exit polls and pre-election polls about people who did vote. But then there's also the question of voter suppression efforts that it's going to take us a long time to understand, and how much would the outcome have been different? Would we be even having, you know, would we be having the discussion of course, demography is destiny if some of those voter suppression efforts weren't there? That actual vote choice might have looked very differently if more people either didn't feel, you know, intimidated by voting or didn't feel that the obstacles were too high for voting. And that's something that we'll need some time to answer that. So we have taken up a lot of people's time today. We made it all the way to 3:30, and I could keep going with this, but I know we need to stop. So let me just say thank you to everyone for your time and for your care in thinking about what to discuss today. You know, as a part of me was a little relieved that this is my last election related thing that's on my schedule today, but now I kind of want to schedule another one for like sometime in January or February, and I'll kind of come together again. So be warned, there may be an invitation from me in a few weeks to do something like this again. So with that, we'll call it a day. Have a lovely weekend and a safe holiday. And it was great to see everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Debbie.
Thank you, everybody. Nice to see and meet some of you.